But after about pounding away at it for 10 minutes and using my whole body weight to weigh it down, I finally got it pretty close to the angle I was looking for. By the way, this is probably one of those don't try it at home moments, but I didn't really have much other option. I also left some extra steel on the end so that I could just cut it to length once I had the bend done. The hitch assembly did take a little bit of work to get it to slide into the steel, but the 1-inch steel worked perfectly for it. And with that finished up, I can weld the hitch onto the trailer along with a couple support pieces. For the last part of the trailer, I'm going to make a 4-corner jack system for when the trailer's parked. So first I'm just cutting some 1-inch little pieces of tubing, and then drilling a hole straight through and mounting one onto each corner of the trailer.
I don't feel like playing anything today, but I'm just gonna say that I'm in my Discord VC right now. So like, if you just add me on Discord and then look at my profile description, there's a invite to my server in which you can just join right now and just start talking to me instead of typing in the text chat, okay? Because I'm not looking at text chat. Just fucking talk to me. My VC is open, alright?
Then I used some 3/4 inch tubing and cut out 4 20-inch bars. Then I marked out holes every inch for the top 8 inches of the bar, as well as 1 2 inches from the far end. Then used a punch to mark them and drilled them through. Then I just welded a little flat bar foot on each one and my jack system is done. So basically how it works is they go in those little 1-inch pieces I cut earlier, and then when the bike's moving they can be pinned up near the top out of the way. And when I park the bike I can move it down to any of the 6 pre-drilled holes and pin it there to help level and stabilize the camper. Now the frame's done, so I'm just going to do any final grinding and sanding it with 80 grit to get it ready for paint. This is my childhood bike that hasn't been ridden in probably over 10 years, so I'm going to use the wheels for this as the wheels for the camper. You know, recycle. Like bicycle. Get it? Never mind. After a quick test ride, everything's working great and I'm ready to paint. To paint, I'm just using regular old rust paint along with a primer. And after the primer dried for about a half hour, I used some semi-gloss black. Now the trailer's complete and we're ready to move on to the body.
If I had a workshop, I would just fucking go nuts.
For the floor of the camper, I'm using some 1/2-inch finished grade pine plywood. And here I'm just cutting it down to the same size as the trailer. I'm then sealing one side of it with some Flex Seal rubberized coating to waterproof it. But this was kind of a mistake and you'll see why later, so I just leave it raw for now and you can finish it up after, using either the Flex Seal or the fiberglassing method I use later. The main structure of the walls are going to be made out of the same 1/2 inch plywood, though if I built it again in the future, I'd probably make it out of 1/4 inch because with the foam on the outside, it'll still be plenty rigid and you'll save about 20 or 30 pounds of weight. So I measured out all the dimensions and traced in all the cut lines, and also marked out the cut lines for the door while it was all one piece and nice and square. By the way, I'm going to release some plans for this with the exact specifications I used and put them in the description below. To cut this out, I'm just using a jigsaw with a metal blade, and a good tip that can save you a sheet of plywood is take the time to make sure your blade's perfectly square, and that'll make sure you have really nice 90-degree cuts. And once I had one side cut, I just laid it down on a fresh sheet of plywood, traced it out, and cut the second side. Now to cut out the door, first I'm using a multi-tool to make a blade starter for the jigsaw, and then jigging it out the same way as the rest. Now I want to make the door double thick so it's 1 inch thick, but I don't have any more full sheets of plywood, so I'm just going to take a couple scraps and glue them onto the front side of the door. I'm also going to rip off a few strips of 1/2 inch plywood to support around the door. By the way, if you don't have a track saw but you have a circular saw, you should definitely consider getting one of these Craig track saw jigs. They're like $150 and they changed my life. And I glued a 2.5 inch wide strip along the bottom of both sides to give me something to screw into when I screw it onto the base. Alright, that's the end of day one of making the frame for the cabin. And here's what we got. And the next day I'm using a flush trim bit in my router to trim off any overhang. Now with everything cut and sanded, I'm going to start cutting the holes for the windows. These are some used RV windows I got off of a local buy and sell for $150 each. So if you have that option available, definitely go for it because they're about $400 or $500 new, and my whole budget for this build is like $1,200. So I couldn't trace the interior rim of the window, so instead I traced the exterior and then used a combination square to set that back a little bit. And then I found this plastic cap that was almost the exact same width to trace in the corners. So before I stand everything up, I ripped some 2.5 inch wide strips of 1/2 inch plywood, and then cut those down to 28 inches and sanded them down. I also set my combination square to about 1.25 inches, and then ran a line along the edges of both sidewalls. 1.25 inches will be about the thickness of the finished ceiling, so this will give me a bit of a guide when I'm lining that up when I'm installing it, as well as the slats I'm about to do next. Then I applied a little bit of glue to the base and stood up one wall and screwed it in with some 2-inch deck screws. And then did the same with the other side. Then I took one of those 28-inch slats I just cut, and then lined it up with the interior side of the line we just drew. Then pre-drilled some holes and screwed it in with some 2-inch deck screws again. I put these around the entire top side of the cabin, every foot or two, and at the base of any curve. This will give the ceiling a little bit more support since it's only going to be foam and some 1/4 inch plywood. It also gave me a base to glue and nail the plywood ceiling onto. Now for the ceiling, I first ripped a 28-inch wide sheet of 1/4 inch plywood, and then I played around with my circular saw on a scrap piece of lumber to get it so that it was cut in about 2/3 of the way through the plywood. Then I measured out where the bends would be in the sheet of plywood and scored lines about every inch. I was hoping just the scores alone would be enough to be able to bend the plywood, but it wasn't, so the solution I came up with was using this clothing steamer and then steaming the scored area for about 10 minutes before I tried to bend it. And then as I was installing it on the camper, I would just slowly work it down while steaming it, and that seemed to work pretty good. I also made sure to cut the piece of plywood so it would end about halfway through one of the slats so that I could join up with the next piece of plywood without seeing any seam.
Look at that. That is cool.
Next, I'm making a stop flange for the door. So with some 1/4 inch plywood, I traced a line about 1 inch offset from the current cutout. Then I drew another line about 2 inches outside. Now to start on the door itself, I got this RV door latch on Amazon, so I'm gonna have to cut away some material to fit this. I really have no idea what I'm doing here, so I'm just kinda taking it as I go. I then used a little piece of 1/4 inch plywood to build it out a little bit because the door latch is meant for 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches and my door is only 1 inch. For a backside cover, I just had this dollar store plastic tray lying around, so I'm just going to cut a little cover out of it and it'll cover up all the guts on the backside of the door. And that's the hardware of the door done, so now back to the body. I got these little USB powered puck lights that I'm going to put in the ceiling, 2 of them, and I just mounted them on using the mounting tape and magnets that came with. I also wanted them to both directly be powered by the USB power bank I'm going to use to power the whole trailer. So I drilled a hole to run the charging cable through. Then I drilled another hole at the back of the camper where I knew the power supply would be and ran both wires directly down the center on the outside of the camper. Then I scored some 1-inch insulation the same way I did the plywood. So to stick the foam onto the plywood, I started using wood glue, though I found out later some other adhesives work better. And then I applied the insulation right over top of the plywood. I had to make sure I was lining up pretty closely with the edges of the walls that didn't have too much sand in to do. And there was sometimes a little bit of a gap between the ceiling plywood and the ceiling foam, so I used this expanding foam insulation to solidify that a little bit. And then I also realized that if you ever get this stuff on anything, it's impossible to get off, so I started using this as my main adhesive instead of the wood glue. Plus I also used some caulking adhesive. So instead of using a million clamps and weights, I just used these 3-inch deck screws to temporarily screw the foam into place while the adhesives dried. And once that all dried, I could take out those temporary screws and begin work on the sides. For the sides, I'm just using 1/2-inch insulation and applying it pretty much the same way. I could also use screw clamps on this. I just had to make sure I didn't go too far into the plywood and come out the other side. And after everything's dried and all the screws and overfilled foam removed, I can go along with my flush trim router and trim everything up. Then I used some 180 grit to sand down all the foam. And the foam was maybe a couple millimeters thicker than the wood trim, so I had to really feather that out on the edges to get it perfectly flush. Then to fill in all the little gaps and cracks left, I just used this regular drywall spackling. Just like drywall, you're gonna have to take your time and probably do a couple coats, and the more time you spend and more perfect you get it looking, the better the final product will look. The next day I sanded it down and did one more touch-up coat, and then sanded it down once more once that dried. And now it's ready for some fiberglass. Like I said before, my budget for this build is like $1,200, so real fiberglass is not going to be in the picture. But I am going to try a technique I've never done before, but it's all over YouTube, called poor man's fiberglass. And to do that, I start off with some canvas drop cloth that's usually used for painting. So these are brand new, but I pre-washed them to shrink them and get out some of the creases. And then I'm just going to go along and iron out the whole sheet. Again, the more time you spend at this, the easier the application is going to be and the better the final result's going to look. So then with a paint roller, I'm going to spread out some Type Bond 2 wood glue over the entire surface of what I'm covering. You want to get everything covered, but you don't want it to be drenched because you don't want the glue to soak through the canvas when you lay it on. Once you've laid it out nice and flat, you can use an iron to go along and make everything perfect. The iron also slightly sears the glue and makes it grab pretty much instantly, which is handy. I then use a good pair of scissors and then cut the canvas with about a ½ inch of overlap. I also made sure to do the sides first and then put the top overlapping over the sides so that it would minimize the risk of any leaks. If you just take your time at this and work with the iron, you can get the canvas to shape to pretty much any shape without any wrinkles. Now I'm using some bare exterior paint. The kind really doesn't matter as long as it's exterior. And I mixed it with about 50% water, and now I'm gonna roll that onto the canvas. So the paint is where all the protection comes from, and this first coat is mixed with water so that this canvas really just soaks it up like a sponge. In total, you're gonna have to do about 3 or 4 coats, gradually going to full strength paint. And after the first 1 or 2, you're gonna be like, "Ah, I f***ed this up," because that's definitely what I was thinking. But if you just sand quickly with 180 grit between each coat and you build up those layers, by the 3rd or 4th coat, I couldn't believe how good it looked. And by the end, you'll have a couple millimeters built up of paint layer and tons of protection. And now the base color of paint is complete, and I'm just going to finish up this interior before I start installing the doors and windows. So here I'm just building a little shelf that'll be over top of my feet. And then sealing in all the sides with some white silicone. Now for the door, I'm using some regular black 3-inch gate hinges that I got at Home Depot. And then after measuring a few times, I'll just pre-drill the holes and put a dab of some white silicone before I screw in some 7/8-inch screws. The silicone will help seal in the screws so that you don't get any leakage of water inside the screw holes and eventually leading to any rot. So to install the windows, I first cut out a flange the exact same way I did for that interior flange on the door by marking a line about 1 inch on both sides of the trace line of the window opening. Then I prepared the window by putting a fresh strip of butyl tape around the interior edge. Then I glued and nailed the interior flange into place. This basically acts as a big washer and overlaps about 1 inch onto the interior rim of the window. Then I can pre-drill a hole and use a 3/4 inch panhead screw to hold the window in place. Then I'll remove any excess butyl tape using a putty knife and put a silicone bead around the exterior edge. Now just a little more waterproofing and this body is pretty much done. So I think another mistake I made is that I probably should have put another overlapping piece of 1/4 inch plywood attached to the exterior of the door, like another big flange, so that I could weather strip behind it, and then I wouldn't have to worry about any water getting inside the cracks of the door, and that way I wouldn't have to seal all the interior components of both the door and the frame. And one last thing I did specifically for looks was use a little bit of black outdoor paint and painted on some 1 inch trim lines around all the seams. I think this made it look way more professional and really made it pop and look like a real trailer. Then I used some more Flex Seal and just waterproofed in that bottom edge. Like I said before though, if I did it again, I'd probably use the poor man's fiberglass on the bottom too. And then to mount it onto the frame, I just drilled some 1/4 inch holes about every 2 feet around the frame. And then use some standard 1/4 inch by 3 inch lag bolts to bolt it into place. I also siliconed both sides so that I could waterproof it as much as possible. And the last thing I did was add this cheap door shroud that I got on Amazon and painted black. So I put a silicone bead along the back edge and then screwed it into place with some 7/8 inch screws. Now my new bike camper is ready for its first journey in the morning.
You should have put some like hooks and stuff.
There was a hazy day downtown LA when I met her on an elevator on its way.
So after a quick test ride, I noticed right away that the one wheel wasn't going to be able to take the weight of the camper. And that's because it was a front wheel that had a much smaller quick release axle. So I'm just going to temporarily switch that out with another rear wheel of a bike until I can get that axle replaced. What might work even better in the future is if I framed another bar around the outside of the wheel and then put down another piece of flat bar so I could support the wheel on both sides. But overall, it's pretty sturdy as is now. So my first trip is going to be from my shop to my parents' house, which is about 15 kilometers, over some paved and some dirt roads and some backcountry trails.
It's a little funny, and I thought
So it's fairly windy this day, as you can hear, but it actually performed a lot better than I thought, and it wasn't terrible going against the wind even. You basically just had to use your gears right and use that gear reduction to your advantage as much as possible, and just know that you're going to be going about a third slower than if you were just biking normally. In total, the trip took me about 2 hours, but I'd say at least a half hour that was dedicated to filming and returning back to get a camera. Half hour that was dedicated to filming and returning back to get a camera.
Did he say?
2 hours, about a third slow. Use that gear reduction to your advantage as much as possible, and just know that you're going to be going about a third slower than if you were just biking normally. In total, the trip took me about 2 hours, but I'd say at least a half hour that was dedicated to filming and returning back to get a camera. Overall, this was a super rewarding build, and it's rewarding every time you use it. The sleep in it really isn't too bad. I'm 6'4" tall and I can spread out perfectly. The total weight of it is about 120 pounds and it pulls quite a bit easier than I thought. But most importantly, it's always great to get out of the house and spend time with nature and reconnect with what's important. Not to mention, everybody that sees it loves it, especially the all-wood interior. If you like this video and this build, please consider subscribing. I do a whole bunch of random builds, and I'm trying to go into more and more cool ideas like this bike camper.
He said 1,200. Guessing. You buy his plans for $5. That's not too bad. It's got Amazon affiliate links. Cool, you got Amazon.com links. How much is the shipping? Like $9, okay. Well, it's not too bad. I think it's pretty cool. You know. A portable pizza oven build is stupid. Why would you do that? That would not be able to retain enough heat. I mean, like, maybe.
Last year I made a pizza oven that didn't work and everybody told me it was going to explode. And then this happened. But let's back that up and see what really happened here. Now, I'm not saying this would never explode, but I did use it in my igloo for about 2 months, sometimes running 6 to 8 hours a day, and never had any issue. I just don't think the small fire that's inside is hot enough to ruin the structural integrity of the concrete. But like I said before, this pizza oven didn't really work, so now I'm on a mission to build a new portable wood-fired pizza oven that really works and can cook me a good homemade wood-fired pizza in a couple of minutes. And I can take it with me to parties or wherever I'm going. So to start off, I stole all the bowls I could find from my mom's house, and this is basically going to be the interior mold of the oven, so I'm just going to build the whole thing around this. And what I finally ended up going with was this flower greenhouse dome from the dollar store that's about 12 by 12 inches. So I taped this onto a piece of scrap particle board I had lying around, and then I'm tracing a line 1.5 inches outside the dome as I want this to be the final wall thickness. Then after cutting it out with my jigsaw, I duplicated it using skills I can't reveal. Actually, I can, I just traced it and cut out another one. Then I cut up some thick gauge wire to be a little bit of reinforcement for the concrete slab I'm about to pour. So to pour this slab, I'm going to need some walls, and to do that I'm using some foam board. So I cut out 1.5 inch strip and then scored it about every 1/2 inch so it's a lot easier to bend. Then I just hot glued these in place as walls around the entire perimeter of one of the pieces of wood we cut. So for the slab base I'm making, I'm just using some sand concrete mix, and I mixed it up to the consistency of about a big bowl of jello. And then before I pour it, I cut this piece of 1/4 inch plywood that's about 1.5 inches smaller than the mold in every direction. And then once I demold this slab, I'm going to fill this in with some refractory cement just to give it a little bit of added heat protection. So I filled it up about halfway with the concrete mix and then added in the reinforcement bars before topping it up with some fresh concrete. I then used my oscillating sander without any paper on it to vibrate the edge of the mold and release any of those air bubbles that are trapped in the concrete mix. And a day later that looks pretty good, but I'm going to leave it in the mold for now and move on to the body. So I have this dome taped onto our other sheet of wood, and then I made up this cardboard template that I'm going to use to cut out some wood that'll ultimately be the mold for the archway. I also cut out one piece that was 1.5 inches wider for the end cap of the mold. Then I could just cover up all the ribs with some foam board. And one last thing, I'm using this tin jar I got at a dollar store that's going to ultimately be my smokestack, but for now I'm just tacking it in place so that there will be a spot for it in the concrete I'm about to do. So for the first layer, I'm just mixing up an insulating mix that's 1 part Portland cement to 5 parts perlite, and then enough water to get everything wet. This is a really lightweight concrete mix, plus the perlite helps insulate from the heat. Since the perlite is so lightweight and it basically acts as the gravel in the mix, so I just pack it in piece by piece until I can work my way up these walls and get a whole layer over the entire mold. This only took about 10 minutes to do the whole thing, but this happened a couple times. But the third time I finally got everything to stick, and after leaving it for a day, I can start on the second layer. For this layer, I'm using the sand concrete mix I used for the slab, and then mixing that in with about 1 part of the mix to 2 parts of perlite. I decided to switch to this for the second layer because since I have such a thin wall to work with because I'm building a mini pizza oven that I want to be portable, I think the sand in this gives it a little bit of extra strength and should hold everything together when I have to move it over to the slab. And this second layer made it look a lot more solid, and I'm ready to move on to the brick. So these are some thin concrete bricks I got off a local buy and sell, and as you can tell by the box, they are very local. So basically I'm just going to cut these up using my tile saw, and then I'm going to mortar them in place over the entire thing to make it look like it's basically a brick pizza oven. So before I get too far, I'm going to take out that tin smokestack I was talking about earlier. And then I'm going to sand off all the paint with some 120 grit. And using a cut-off wheel in my grinder, I cut off the closed end. And then painted it with some high heat barbecue paint. Now back to bricklaying. Now with all the brick laid, I mixed up a slightly frothier batch of mortar, and I'm just going to squeeze this into all the gaps. I'm trying to be as careful as possible so that there's as little cleanup as possible, but you inevitably are going to get some on the surface of the bricks. But not to worry, you can clean it up about a half hour after it sets. What I found worked well is I'd go through and fill all the gaps for about 5 or 10 bricks, and then use my finger to pack all this in. Then once I had everything filled, I could go back to where I started, and it was already dry enough that I could use my finger and even out the mortar and make it look like a more respectable brick lay. Then I used a brush to even it out even further. As for all those mortar stains, you can just use a damp rag or a sponge, and just slowly work them out, adding more water as needed until they're pretty much gone. You want to make sure you wipe all this off within an hour of doing the mortar, because otherwise it's going to be on there permanently. Now I'll let that cure for a couple days and back to demolding our base. After prying it off of the wood with a screwdriver, the indent we made looks pretty good, so I'm going to go ahead and fill that up with some of this refractory cement. This stuff is really gummy and thick since it's pretty much just clay, so I found adding a little bit of water made it a lot more workable. So I got it as smooth as I could, and after it cured for a day, it looked pretty good.
Actually does look really good.
Now to demolding the body of the pizza oven. Basically, I cut away what I could with a box cutter and then scored along the bottom edge to help it release better. Now, I was worried about how structurally strong the shell would be, so I was trying to be really careful here, but after moving it around a bit, it felt really solid, so I flipped it up on its side, and I'm going to add a layer of refractory cement to the inside of it. So this batch I watered down quite a bit to get it into more of a paste, and then I just spread an even layer over the entire inside. Then I put a line of mortar along the base where the two pieces will join, and set the body in place. Next, I took a few pieces of scrap wood I had laying around and assembled this box that I'm going to use below the slab. Since the concrete's going to get really hot from the fire inside, this will raise the body up off of the table that it's sitting on. And once the wood glue dries, we'll glue it to the bottom of the slab. For the last part, I'm making a little steel door for the front. So I have this old barbecue door, but you can just use sheet metal or whatever kind of metal you have around. So I used one of the wooden arches I created for the mold to trace out a template. And then I drew on some little wings out the side and cut it out with a cutoff wheel. Once I had everything cut out to shape, I just scored a line around the bend lines and then put it in my vise and bent them to 90-degree angles. Then I drilled these 3/8 inch air holes at the bottom of the door to let in air even when the door is on and the fire can keep burning. Then drilled one hole for a doorknob and gave it some barbecue paint. And back to that wooden base, I just used some construction adhesive caulk to glue it to the bottom of the concrete. Now everything's cured for about a week, so it's time to light up my pizza oven for the first time. So I had the fire going for about 10 minutes before I put the pizza in, and then I used this barbecue brush to scrape everything towards the back so that there was room for the pizza. This is the first one I've made in this oven, so I wasn't exactly sure what I was doing or how long it was going to take. But after about a minute, I already had to pull it out because it was getting burnt on one side. So I pulled it out and turned it about a third and then put it back in and then did that once more. All in all, it cooked in about 4 minutes, and as I do more and more, I should be able to perfect the process even more and definitely get rid of those burnt crusts. But hey, even still, it was still delicious. So my goal was to make a portable wood-fired pizza oven that actually worked, and I would say I succeeded in that. It actually weighs less than I thought it was gonna. It's only about 45 pounds, and it's fairly easy to take around. I just buckle it in the seat of my car. It cooks a pizza in anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes, and you have to turn it 1 to 2 times. And besides that, I just love the way it looks, and I can't wait to show up to some parties to cook some pizzas. If you like this video, please consider subscribing. I do a whole bunch of build videos, and I try to spend as much time as I possibly can to make the best content possible.
In this video, we're going to show you how to build an earthen oven. The existence of ovens like this is easily documented for the 18th century. In fact, just about every ancient culture had a very similar oven. There's one particular woodcut illustration from medieval times depicting an earthen oven built on a wagon. There are references in 18th century literature and also archaeological evidence that you would find ovens like this in private homes and in fort settings. There are also references to communal ovens where the baker would bake bread for an entire village. We're going to need several things to make our mud oven out of. We're going to need sand. That's the major component of our oven. We're going to need a good bit of clay. This is dried clay you can get at a masonry store, or you can get a damp clay out of a ditch bank. You're going to need straw or dried grass or maybe hay. You may need some bricks, so some fire bricks, even regular bricks will work. And you're going to need a canvas tarp to mix your cob together with, and you're definitely going to need a good bit of water. Before you build your oven, you have to consider what you're going to build your oven on. There are historical examples of ovens built on tables or on brick or stone plinths on hearths. On the top of our very sturdy table, we've laid out a layer of fire brick. That's going to be the floor of our oven. We've also chalked out here the design, about 22 inches across at the bottom on the inside. That's the inside measurement. It's going to be, the walls are going to be about 6 inches thick. So we've got markings here so we can see about how big it's going to look on the surface. The door width right here is about 12 inches across, so we can get something as big as a pie in without too much trouble. First thing we're going to do is we're going to build the core. It's going to be like a sandcastle, just wet sand that we're going to build the oven over the top of. Sometimes you'll see other people doing it with sticks and things like this. This is going to be much easier and quicker. This is where our door is going to be. I just went ahead and put a couple bricks in here to be the inner core of the door. They'll be removed. And right here I've placed a brick wall to give us a nice flat surface to build up against. So we've taken about an hour to put this together. We've used very wet sand so that it stays into shape. Now we've got to make sure that this stays wet till we get our first layer on. There aren't very many critical things about the shape and the size of your particular oven, but there is one critical thing, and that is the height of the opening tunnel here compared to the height of your dome. These need to be a particular ratio, or else the air won't draw through this when you're burning the wood inside of the thing. So this is a between 65 and 60%, or about 63% height here compared to the height there. The next thing we're going to do is put paper on this. We're going to put paper, we're going to wet it down so it'll give us a layer to separate. So when we take the sand out, it doesn't stick to the inner surface. Got the paper covering done on our sand inner core. This will make it much easier to take the core out from underneath it. Now it's time to make the first layer of cob or mud to put on our oven. This innermost layer of mud or cob that we're going to put on our oven is just sand and clay. About 2 parts sand to 1 part clay. We mix those two together so that they're very well mixed, and then we just put it on there. We want to make sure it's got about the right consistency, that we can still work it, but it isn't so wet that it's sloppy. And you want to make sure to have air on the side of a little more sand than too much clay. The more clay you've got, the more it's going to shrink and crack. So you probably want to make up a bunch of this cob beforehand. It ages well. It won't go bad waiting overnight. And that way, as soon as you're done with your sandcastle core, you can start putting it on right away, and you don't have to worry about that drying out and blowing away while you're making your cob. So learning just the right consistency, that can be a trick. As you see here, I've been stomping on this pile for a little while. This is starting to feel really good. It forms up into a ball, like a snowball. It doesn't deform easily. It's not sloppy. You can still form it into any shape you want, and it's not too drippy either. That's what you're looking for, something that holds together well, but still moldable. So we're working on putting this first layer on. This is a layer without any straw in it, because that would just burn up anyway. It's about 3 inches thick, and we're starting at the very bottom. We're going to work our way up. That way we can watch as we go to make sure our thickness stays about the same. Well, we finished the inner mud layer yesterday afternoon, and we let this set overnight, and it's just slightly firmer than it was. We don't want to let it get too dry, or else the next layer won't adhere to this layer properly. We've scratched this layer a little bit so that the next layer of cob we put on here will adhere nicely. This next layer of cob that we put on, it's going to have grass or hay or straw in it to give it a lot more strength than this inner layer. We're going to mix our clay and our sand first. As soon as that's getting close to the right consistency, that's when we'll add our other binder material here. So I've got this mixed up. I'm going to mix this up just slightly wetter. It's feeling like a pretty good consistency now under my feet. And since we're going to add in this dry straw here, it's going to dry it up a little bit, so I'm going to start with a slightly wetter mixture. But we wanted to get this mixed first and then add in the binder. This will add some amazing strength to it. When it dries up, it really binds it together. So it's helpful to make this cob up beforehand. It really makes it work better if it's a couple days old, but you don't want to let it get too old, because as it's wet for a long time, the grass will start to rot in there. So you don't want that to happen. If it's a day or two old, keep it wrapped in plastic so it's wet and pliable. It'll really work even better after a day or two. So to make this go faster, I suggest you invite a bunch of friends over. Have a cob party. They can be stomping on this stuff while you're putting it on your stove. Everyone will have fun.
Yeah.
Well, I've got about 5 or 6 loaves of big loaves of cob here ready to go. I think that's a good start. I'm not sure exactly how many it's going to take to cover this oven, so we're going to put this on, and then I'll see how much more I need to make. I've got marks here on the table to get about 2.5 or 3 inches for the outside layer. We're going to start putting on our loaves. We're going to make sure that they butt up well with the inner core here, so there isn't a big airspace between them. And I'll just start adding these on all the way around. Okay, there it is. We've got the second layer of a cob type material on here. This is the stuff with the straw that's built into it. It does, as you work it, it kind of sags down some, so you might want to start a little thinner at the bottom than the finish, expecting some of it to sag down into position a little bit. This gives us a good opportunity to look at the cross section about what's going on here. You can see the cob's a little thicker down at the bottom than it is at the top because it's kind of sagged a little bit. You can see our outer cob core, our inner core that doesn't have the straw in it, and here's the sand core on the inside. We're going to add a little bit to the outside here. We're going to give it a nice rounded opening because the rounded opening is going to have more strength than this sharp edge. Well, we've finished putting our rounded opening on the oven, so it'll be a little bit stronger. We made sure to mate the cob that we added back into this other stuff. Whenever you add two pieces together, you really have to work it so that the two pieces adhere to each other and it just doesn't fall off. We added a little bit of sand on the front to help support that lip. Depending on where you're at, your environment, the time of year, what the humidity is, this will take 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, maybe even a little longer for it to get dry enough for it to even think about warming it up from the inside. While this is drying, you don't want to get it rained on, so you're going to need to protect this from the weather, but don't cover it with plastic so that it can't dry. So you want to protect it from the rain, but let it breathe. So it's only been about 24 hours since we've been here last, but it's firmed up enough with how the weather is here that we were able to go ahead and pull out some of the sand. I haven't gone and dug the whole thing out, but I want to let it start to dry out on the inside and even peel off some of the paper if you want to, but that'll all burn out anyway. But we're just dug it out about halfway. We'll come back in a couple more days to take out more. We've removed the sand core from this oven and we've given it a couple weeks to dry, so it's almost ready to fire. You may not have to wait this long if you build an oven, but if it's not adequately dry before you fire it, it'll cause cracking, or at least more cracking than normal in the body. Even if you wait like we did, it's inevitable that some cracking will occur. Don't be alarmed. If the cracks are especially big, you can repair them with a little extra sand and clay and let that dry in place. We've employed a few warming fires in this oven and it's dried out well. We've gotten a few cracks, but overall we're really pleased. The walls of this oven are extremely durable. Here's a brick of the material, and it takes a lot to break this material up, so if you need to do modifications, you'll really have to chop at it. However, as sturdy as this is, it still needs to be protected from the weather. This is water soluble and it'll just wash away with the rain, so if we need this to last a while, we're gonna have to build a little roof over it. Make sure to watch part 2 of this video where we learn how to bake bread in one of these earthen ovens. You know, this looks pretty good. I think I'm gonna fire it up.
In 2018, aggressive bees started to take over the Texas city of El Paso. The swarm of millions of bees threatened the animals and locals, but when people tried to get rid of the bees, they paid dearly for it. Yes, on that day we lost the battle, but not the war, because we have allies who know something even queen bees are afraid of. Many people are scared of bees. Everyone has their reasons. Some got stung and it was too painful. Some heard other people's stories, and some just needed to read about the killer bees. Whatever the case, the reaction is always pretty much the same. Though they say that people are often afraid of what they don't understand, bees are easy to defeat if you know where to hit them. Meet the beekeepers! Really cool guys! By the way, depictions of humans collecting honey from wild bees date to 10,000 years ago. So mankind managed to figure out what's what over such a long time. How bee colonies work, who's responsible for what, and of course who's in charge. If you ask the bees, the most important figure in the hive is, of course, the queen bee. She's much larger and heavier than any other bee, and her only function is to produce offspring. Of course, there can only be one queen in the hive or chaos will erupt. But the queens don't live forever. If a new queen is about to appear, the old one takes some of the workers and moves to another place to establish a new colony there. If you see a swarm of bees, chances are it's just moving day. They won't bother anyone unless they're threatened. Imagine you're moving from one apartment to another. Do you feel like stopping somewhere in the middle of the street carrying a sofa just to fight someone? However, moving can affect honey production, and so beekeepers can kill the new queen. But only if the old queen is still fulfilling her royal duties. When she begins to produce sick offspring or doesn't lay eggs at all, the rest of the bees become lethargic, which means they aren't eager to work. Bees plus laziness equals no honey. So the beekeepers have to eliminate the old queen. Sometimes you can divide a hive this way and get 2 of them, which means twice as much honey. Nothing personal, just business. But don't think you need to give bees hints when something goes wrong in their hive. These are really smart insects that notice if the queen is failing and can quietly replace it. The old queen remains in the hive and continues to work until the bees raise a new one and she starts working. After that, the old queen is either banished from the hive or the bees destroy her. Well, as I say, they are independent creatures, so it's not easy to get them to accept a new queen if a human is trying to introduce her into the hive. Beekeepers have a bunch of tricks and even special cages where queens are placed so that the rest of the swarm get used to them. But, sometimes it doesn't work. Worker bees tend to reject stranger queens, especially if they're not genetically related. In these cases, the workers recognize the queen as the invader and try to defend the hive. They do this by forming a ball around the queen and biting her to destroy. Knowing all these details helps beekeepers get rid of hives located in places they aren't supposed to be. When bees really threaten people, you have to give up moving the hive, and the only way is to eliminate the queen bee. While it lays 2,000 eggs a day, there's no hope the bees will disappear. Well, to get to the queen, you first have to get rid of most of the worker bees with the help of poison, and then pour it right into the hive, and then seal it for a couple of days. Experienced beekeepers say this is the only guaranteed way. Who are we not to trust them?
Watch his movement. Now.
There's a dark side to control the animals. They won't tell you about this in school because people prefer to keep silent about such facts. But I found the truth. It's hidden in this. You ruined such a great moment. So it's hidden in this book, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind by Professor Yuval Noah Harari. According to him, humans begin to exert control over animals already at the hunting stage. Nomads who hunted wild rams targeted only adult males or old, sick females. Why? So that animals could keep on procreating. Then when it came to domestication, the ancient humans began to remove aggressive males that resisted control. Then they got rid of overly curious females and so on. Things got even harsher when it came to pigs. To prevent them from escaping, people removed their snouts. Simple and cruel logic. If you take away the ability to sniff from an animal, it'll depend on you completely. In short, in terms of evolution, we've certainly succeeded as a species. But at what cost? Could manipulating bees with the help of their queens also be considered a way of controlling animals? Perhaps. But the death of the queen bee doesn't always mean the end of the entire colony. Yes, when the queen dies, the entire colony, often numbering up to 100,000 bees, is in temporary disarray. The queen bee releases chemical signals that prevent worker bees from laying eggs, but soon after her death, these chemical signals wear off and worker bees can do it again. In short, they can start to multiply at a terrible rate, which means the entire system breaks down. If you don't fix it in time, the swarm will die. Usually, worker bees house the eggs or larvae less than 3 days old in special cells for future queens. The bees feed the larvae with royal jelly until they turn into young queen bees, take nuptial flights, mate in the air, and try to kill each other. The last queen bee standing gets the crown. What about other animals? Someone larger and less ambiguous. Let's take wolves. Could the death of one wolf cause the rest of the pack to fall apart? Research shows this is possible, but a lot depends on the size of the pack the season, and of course the status of the wolf. Each wolf plays an important role in the survival of the pack, but the death of an alpha female, alpha male, or both of them can be a disaster. A small pack that lost its leaders, especially during the breeding season or just before it, will dissolve with a 77% chance. By the way, if leaders die of natural causes, it's less likely to result in the pack dissolving than when the death of the leader was caused by humans. I honestly don't know how it works. Maybe the involvement of humans somehow undermines the wolf's authority. The dead alphas are no longer considered cool, which means there's no point in sticking together. Actually, different animals choose their leaders based on different criteria. Most people think the strongest or most aggressive individual should be in charge, but in real life, everything is way more interesting. African elephants and killer whales choose the oldest female as their leader. Spotted hyenas inherit their title. To become an alpha female, your mother has to be an alpha female. The three-spined sticklebacks generally choose their leader based on physical appeal. Even in chimp troops, when male aggression really plays a decisive role, we can sometimes witness insane things happening. Chimps do politics. Small and peaceful males may well be at the head of a troop if they build coalitions with fellow chimps. Grooming, sharing the fruit, tickling.
I hope he talks about it, but there was this thing about
the infant. I'm serious. You know how some politicians like to use kids' photos in their election campaigns? Chimps do the same. Still not impressed? Ha! Bees have elections. Instead of arguments, their debates are based on dancing. Despite having a queen, bees act democratically when they...
Yeah, they found out that it's not from the dancing. They dance, they do, and because that's what it looks like. But they're releasing pheromones and they're flapping and wiggling to kind of shake them out. Like it's not a dance.
They decide where to move an endangered hive. The scouts first look for suitable nest sites, then return to dance to describe how cool their newfound site is. The area most of the scouts agree to investigate wins. This means the whole swarm will move there. You get it, right? We're talking about elections among insects. I wouldn't be surprised if it turns out they removed the queen only after they reached a consensus. Your time is over. Vote! We must vote! Damn, I totally forgot we have a democratic hive. To be honest, after this, I thought the bees could no longer surprise me. Well, really, what could be cooler than
There
that?
was this thing with these chimps where there was some rogue males that formed a posse that was going around just slaughtering. And eventually what happened was, like, most chimps were really, really docile, but eventually when they terrorized enough people, like, all of the chimps rose up at once and literally tore them to pieces.
But they did. They learned to clone themselves. South African Cape honeybees can make perfect copies of themselves. They sneak into the hives of other bee species and lay clone eggs there.
200,000 units are ready, with 1 million more well on the way.
But the clones are not going to work. They only demand food, and this gradually leads to the collapse of the hive. Yes, they're harmless alone, but what if there are hundreds or even thousands of such bees in a colony? It just won't sustain itself. But the most surprising thing is not even the cloning itself. Scientists found out that the bees with this parasitic behavior are genetically identical descendants of a single working bee that lived in 1990. That is, 30 years ago, some bee decided to clone itself, and the process is still going on. This lineage of clones is responsible for the collapse of 10% of honeybee colonies every year. By the way, if cloned bees don't capture stranger hives, they completely destroy their own. Because, well, no one wants to work together for a common cause. They don't actually want to work at all. I'm so sick of it. No one wants to work. There are only freeloaders around. So you'll do the dishes, you'll do the cleaning, and you'll get nectar. I'm so sick of it. No one wants to work. There are only freeloaders around. Cloning doesn't seem to be beneficial to the bee population. Meanwhile, some ambystoma salamanders in North America have adapted so much to this way of breeding, they even abandoned males. Yes, females simply clone themselves generation after generation. Many scientists believe this is a dead end, as the lack of fresh genes could make females weaker. But hey, salamanders have been doing this for 6 million years. If cloning had downsides, they would have gone extinct long ago. Instead, clones regenerate 1.5 times faster than species that reproduce in a traditional way. How's this even possible? Seems like the salamanders have found a way to diversify their genome. They simply steal someone else's DNA, but they don't use it for fertilizing eggs, as one might think, but add it to their own genome, and then clone themselves. In one article, I found a terrific name for this reproduction process: kleptogenesis. It sounds absurd, but it really works. If all cloning worked like that, we'd hit the jackpot. Imagine you're a farmer, and of course you take care of your farm, but there's always a risk that you can get sick calves with slim chances of survival. Cloning can fix that. You can endlessly create copies of the best animals.
Wait, you bred a pig?
Sure did. Most genetically perfect one in the contest.
Oink. Perhaps as a result, we could accidentally breed super cows that would eventually take over the planet. But that's a story for another time. See you later.
Because I used to just get food stuck in that little hole. There was like a hole where it was, because the gums were fucked. I don't know. Whatever. I don't care. I'm just gonna. The kids been sleeping for like an hour. How long have I been streaming? An hour